Well, good morning, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are whom I've never met before, and I'm so glad you're here. And I've noticed there are a few folk whom I know and know well, so it's really good to see you people today. I'm really excited about what we're doing today. But before I get to that, I just want to say a little bit about the context for this work. So my name is Mark Roberts, and I am the senior strategist at the Max Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary, and I'm the leader of our third work. And our purpose of our third work is to help people flourish in the third of life, by which we understand to live fully and fruitfully and faithfully as disciples of Jesus. And we produce a lot of resources to help folks flourish and to help churches do this work with their people. You can find these resources in the third section of the Dupree Center website, and you'll see a link for that in the chat. Among the resources that we've been able to produce, you'll discover a bunch of webinars that we have done in which we interview leaders of note who have wisdom about the third of life. And today we add a new webinar interview into the mix as I talk with Dr. Amy Hanson. And let me just say a word about the game plan for this webinar. After I introduce Dr. Hanson, she and I, I did a bad thing, sorry. She and I are going to respond, we're going to talk for a while, about 35 minutes. And then we will respond to questions from you. We're going to do questions in the Q&A function, so not in the chat, but in the Q&A function. With a large group like this, it gets kind of crazy to try and do it live. So we're going to do it in the Q&A. And that means at any time during our conversation, if you have a question, just pop it in the Q&A. And when the time comes, I'll get to it and let Amy know so she can respond. I should also mention that this webinar is being taped and will be available at the Dupree Center website or on YouTube. So you can view it again, you can share it with your associates or your friends, whatever you want to do. So 4 years ago, I started building the Dupree Center's Flourishing in the Third of Life initiative. And one of my very first tasks was to do an in-depth survey of literature on the third of life, especially in relationship to Christian faith. And I found several helpful books, but one stood out as uniquely insightful and encouraging. And this book was Baby Boomers and Beyond, Tapping the Ministry Talents and Passions of Adults Over 50 by Dr. Amy Hanson. Since I found her book so helpful, I did some research to learn more about Dr. Hanson, and I discovered that she has a lifelong calling to serve older adults in the church. I learned that when she was only 23, she became the full-time active adult minister for a church in Las Vegas, and she led a ministry for over 300 adults aged 50 and over. In time, Amy pursued further education for her work with older adults, ultimately earning a PhD in gerontology and human sciences from the University of Nebraska. And she teaches gerontology courses there these days. Because of her unique qualifications, Dr. Hanson has been a widely sought after speaker and consultant. She's worked with dozens of churches, helping them to develop biblically wise, scientifically informed, and practically effective ministries with baby boomers, which, by the way, that's folks between 57 and 75 years of age. So along the way, I was able to meet Dr. Hanson, and we discovered a deep alignment between her work and that of the Dupree Center. Amy has more wisdom, really, than any person I know, not only about third flourishing, but also and especially for churches that want, to use her language, to tap the ministry talents and passions of adults over 50. So I expect many of you in this webinar already know Amy and her work, but if you don't, I am delighted to introduce you to her. Amy, thank you so much for joining our webinar, which, by the way, we've called Third and the Church, Expansive Vision and Practical Tools. So thanks, Amy, for being here.
Thanks for having me. Hello to everyone. Excited to be here.
It's good. So Amy, when I introduced you, I mentioned that you were a full-time church leader working with older adults when you were only 23. Now, that may be a record.
Weird.
But I'm sure folks are kind of wondering, like, wow, how did that happen? How did you get into that? How did that all begin for you?
Yeah, so just a little bit of my story. I even in high school, junior high, I kind of had a bent this way. I volunteered to be, someone who would, as a teen, work at the hospital, and it was called the Candy Striper back in the day. But when we did our training, we got to try all the different areas, and then we got to decide. And most of the teens were deciding, hey, I want to take flowers to the new moms that have had a baby. But I said, nope, I want to do the geriatric hospital, which is what it was called in my hometown. What a word. I mean, now I'd be on them for that. But it was like a nursing home. And so I was doing that one day a week after school. And I went on to a Christian college and knew I wanted to work with people, do something in ministry. And I just had a bent this direction. I was kind of interested in what is this whole older adult thing. And this has been, 27 years ago now, I think I was figuring out. And I started pursuing internships in the summer, that would expose me to churches that had a senior adult ministry. I took some classes on this and just kind of kept feeling like, man, this is something new and this is something cutting edge, and I can be like a pioneer in this area, which people don't usually think about that when they think of older adults, but it was. So I just kept going through doors that God opened. Like I said, pursuing internships and further education and saying yes to opportunities. I had professors who would, invite me to write papers in that direction. And then I landed in Las Vegas at a large church. Started out and agreed to be an intern to begin, and then was part-time for about 6 months, and then started leading that ministry. And Las Vegas is a fun place to do this because a lot of people move out there to retire and think they're going to gamble and golf. And yet, many of them have a hole in their heart, right, that can't be filled up by those things. So we got to try a lot of things, and I got to kind of learn about ministry, which just continued to fuel my desire to see more churches do this. And that, that led to me doing more speaking and then wanting to further my education. And it's really just been a journey, right, where I've kind of just said yes along the way to the opportunities that have come up.
So today, you're not quite 23 anymore.
No.
But you're still in this line of work, and really with a strong sense of calling. How do you understand your calling today? What is it that God wants you to do with boomers in the church?
Yeah. For so much my work, I think, or personal kind of calling on this has been to like wake up the church to the, reality of our growing numbers of older adults and the potential that rests there. And that still is, that still kind of burns just as hot inside of me now, but I'm actually getting to kind of see it for, go back 15 years or whatever. And I'm sort of saying, look what's coming, right? Let's get ready. And, we're like living into it now. I mean, like you said, boomers are between 57 to 75, born 1946 to 1964. So what I was kind of heralding, let's prepare for this.
Mhm.
We're getting to kind of do and live out. So I still feel my calling kind of is the same way, to say, hey, church, let's get on board. Let's seize what God's doing right now, and be a part of that.
So you sort of just mentioned this, but let me ask to make it even super clear. So why should a church do this? I mean, if you're out there and you're doing church and you're doing stuff and somebody says, hey, it'd be really good to think about our ministry with boomers. Why?
Yeah. So, never before in history have so many people lived for so long with so much health and vitality and the capacity to give. There are first time ever more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 5. And, we could dig into more of the demographics or statistics, but I do think that's one of the reasons why churches should pay attention to it, is because it is a demographic reality, and those aren't just numbers. Every one of those numbers represents a person and a soul. So if we want to be people as church leaders who are paying attention to what's happening in the culture, we want to be paying attention to like, hey, look, we've got a lot of people in this age group. And I think, something that struck me is, for a while now, government is paying attention to this, healthcare is paying attention to this, merchandising, travel industry, fashion, they're all paying attention to this, and some are worried about it, right? Like some are like, "Ugh, is the social security system going to go off because, or are we going to have enough healthcare workers?" But I think this is why we want to step in as the church into the middle of this conversation, to say, hey, this is actually an opportunity. We can actually see this as something good, that it's not an accident that God has allowed this many people to live for this long at this time in history. And longevity is a gift. It's not a burden, right? It's a gift. Long life is a gift. And so we want to be good stewards of it. And as church leaders, man, what a privilege to be able to come alongside people and to help them steward that gift, to shepherd them, to steward that gift. So that's part of the reason why, I guess.
That's awesome. In my generation of pastors, and I was a parish pastor for a lot of years, we tended to think of ministry, and we would call them seniors. I don't, you may or may not want to talk about the language, but we would think of ministry with seniors mainly in terms of caring for them as things get hard, and visiting them, and visiting in the hospital, and visitation, and of course, you and I both agree that's really important, and the churches tended to do fairly well with that. But you're saying that's not the whole thing, or even maybe for many the main thing. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I find this to be one of the kind of fundamental things that we have to look at and sort of address. Because when we say older adults, or whatever word we use, that is a very diverse group of people. And you think about the different definitions of age. I mean, I'll just throw this out, right? We can define it chronologically, which is the number, putting in, this is my birth certificate, so this means this is how old I am. And we have a lot of programs built on that. Social Security, or getting a cheaper cup of coffee at McDonald's or whatever. Chronological. Functional age is how we function, that biological piece, right? And that has a lot to do with health, observable characteristics about us, how well we're able to physically function, mobility, those kinds of things. Social age is how society defines us by the roles that we play. So that's like grandparenting or retirement. You could be a grandparent at 40, you can be a grandparent at 80, but we may think that if you're a grandparent, that must mean you're, quote, old. Psychological age has a lot to do with how we feel. So I say all that because when it comes to us thinking about churches, we got to think, we've got a big landscape of who older adults are. And definitely there's the group that are in a more functionally, their age is older, right? They're in a place where they need pastoral care, someone to take them the communion elements, or to help find transportation to a doctor's appointment. So, combating loneliness, things like that. And that is a piece of it. But that's just a piece, right? So then there's another group that I would say have really traditionally been more the builder generation, or the silent generation. They're the group now that I would say is, close to pushing, 80 plus in age. And they have different needs too. They may not be in the frail state yet. And they're, but they're dealing with some health changes and a lot of loss in their life. And they maybe not slowing down and deciding, I don't want to drive at night, but I still can drive in the daytime, And then there's this whole baby boomer segment, who, are wrestling with their own aging and what's my purpose now, but many of them may still be working. They physically are pretty much able to do many of the things they used to be able to do. And they're even approaching aging a little differently. So even as you alluded to, boomers in general haven't liked the word senior. Sometimes we can hear that some are okay with that, but for the most part, we kind of hear that, oh, I'm not sure I want to identify with that word. So that's a long way of saying we don't want to neglect the older olds with pastoral care needs, but we also don't want to just lump everybody that's over 55 or everybody that's over 60 into one kind of big pot. We just become more diverse the older that we get.
That's great. So you mentioned McDonald's. When I was 38 years old, I went to get a cup of coffee at McDonald's in Downey, California. It was in the evening, and the girl behind the counter said, "Well, that'll be a quarter." I said, "Well, Why is it a quarter? Straight up. You just said, because that's the senior rate. I'm 38. So there's appearance
Oh,
age, appearance aging, in which I was an expert early on. Now, but you were just talking about older olds who are doing amazing things. So I have a friend, Dale Bruner. Some on this call will know Dale. He's written some amazing Bible commentaries. In his 80s, he'd always worked on the Gospels. In his 80s, he thought, you never worked on Paul. So he wrote a commentary on Romans in his 80s. He got done with that at 88. He said, I need to get my Hebrew better. My Hebrew's kind of gotten weaker. So he is now writing a commentary on Isaiah, and he'll turn 92 next month. Now, I mean, not everybody can do any of that, but that's your point, So some of us were getting cheap coffee at 38. Some are commentaries
exactly.
at 92.
Exactly.
Okay, so one of the things I loved about your book, I love the subtitle. It's part of what, when I was looking, it's like, oh, this is cool. Tapping the ministry talents and passions of adults over 50. So you're really about equipping the church to equip their boomers, their people, for ministry. So I'm curious, how's your book been received by, it's been out for about 13 years now. So how's your book been received by churches and pastors?
I mean, I feel like it's received good, but progress in this area in general, I feel like is kind of slow. Like we haven't really reached a tipping point where, there's a vast majority of churches that are saying, yes, we got to get on board with this. So, I think, like I said, I think most are like, oh yeah, that is something we should consider, but not always taking the next step, right?
So maybe, let me just pause for a moment. This is the commercial. Amy's book is awesome. The link is in the chat. You can buy her book. So, and then, I'm actually serious. I think it's a great book. But the thing I have found, and I'm newer to this work. I mean, you've been doing this probably more than half your life. I've been doing this only for about 4 years. I've been kind of amazed by the number of pastors and very much younger pastors who are saying, wow, I really want to do this. But I don't know what to do. I really need help. I do feel like you sort of mentioned, I think we've sort of crossed some sort of line. And part of it is just that pastors are looking out in their own congregations and in their communities and seeing a lot of older adults. And they're like, well, we need to do well with these people, and we need to help them be disciples of Jesus. And so I'm guessing that we're going to, and you sort of said that we're going to be in a new era. So you've kind of said this already, but if somebody came late to this webinar, how would you summarize your vision? So if the church were just doing great work with older adults, churches, if a church, what would that look like?
Yeah. One of the things I feel like is a part of that is I want churches, my vision would be for churches to see and to view their older adults as critical, essential to the mission of their church, not as a group to just like pacify or kind of placate so they can do the work, right? But instead seeing, hey, this is, they are an essential part of this, right? I mean, that's how I would very succinctly say it. If I was going to say it in a story form, some people that have heard me before that are on this have heard this, but I met a guy who was in his 70s serving in all these ways in a church. And I asked him, what got you into that? And he said, well, I used to sing this song with my granddaughter, and it went like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all good girls go to heaven. When they get there, they will say, we love Jesus every day. And he said, one day I heard her in the other room singing the song, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all good grandpas go to heaven. When they get there, they will say, golf, golf, golf every day.
Oh,
Yeah. And really, I mean, I laughed, but he was very serious. He said, I saw in that moment the kind of legacy I was leaving, and it wasn't what I wanted to leave. So I made adjustments to how I was spending my time. I started picking my grandsons up, and I played tennis with them. And that got me involved with their little sister, which actually got him involved going to church and being involved in various things at church. And, now, and then when I met him, he was serving and leading in different ways. But that story is kind of, what capitalizes, or, puts a bow around what I desire is, to see people thrive, like you say, in finishing well, right? With their families, in the serving that they do, and all components of their life. Doesn't mean the guy never golfed, right? But he was feeling very, empowered to live his life out purposely. And that's what I want churches to have as their vision, is like, let's come alongside people and help them do this.
Well, and as you said, letting them know that they really matter, and they matter to the life of the church. I've seen this played out so interestingly, Amy, and I don't know if I've even talked too much about this, but the church I go to now, I go there because there's a new pastor, someone I've been mentoring. He's been in there just over a year. And I would say he started with a less than robust picture of what the older adults in his congregation, who are majority, what they could do. I think he probably had more of a mind of, we're going to make sure we take care of these folks well, and then we got to reach some younger people. Very typical. But as he got to know these people, he really got the vision you're talking about. And I remember I was there and he was preaching one morning about how we're going to reach our community. And he very directly spoke to the older adults in the congregation, the third folk, and said, we need you. You're essential. And I tell you, I've never heard that before. And so partly I see that, but I'm seeing it also play out in that. So a couple of weeks ago, a new couple, gave their witness in church service. And they talked about, why they're in this church, because they felt so warmly welcome. Well, it wasn't by all the young people. There aren't that many. I mean, it was, and so I'm seeing this in real time, where I think it's exciting for those of us who are older to feel like, hey, you really matter here.
Yeah.
And then I'm excited to see sort of intergenerational barriers come down. And so it's just a great example of what you're talking about here. So, the title of this webinar was Expansive Vision and Practical Tools. So we've been kind of in the vision side of things. So let's get a little more practical. I expect in this webinar, we've got a lot of either pastors or church leader folk that may be paid or not paid. But they're here because they really want to see their churches grow when it comes to discipling and equipping folk in the third of life. And so some of them probably have some good stuff going. Others are thinking, well, I don't know how to start. What should we do? How do we get this thing going? What would you say to those folk? How do they get started?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I would say, there's some fundamental things to focus on, to consider. And they're kind of the big headings. And they're not going to come as like some rocket science thing you've never heard before, but I think, we drill down on them in this particular area. One of those would be relationships, right? Boomers and older adults, just like all of us, but they need relationships in their lives. And often as we get older, our social world is changing, and we may have had those relationships from work, but we're not working anymore, or we've experienced loss. And so, ways of building those relationships, establishing new relationships. We need to relate those relationships with our peers who are walking through similar things. If they're caring for an aging parent, or they have adult kids who have moved back home, or they're caring for grandchildren, to have some peers that can say, I get it too, right? We need that. Their relationship with God, making the assumption that, well, just because somebody's over 60, then they've got that all figured out. No, people are still wanting to grow in their relationship with him. It may be something new with God. So their relationship with God, relationship with other generations, right? The intergenerational piece, like you were talking about, I think is key. So, really thinking about relationships, how we can go about building those and forming those would be foundational. And then another really foundational piece would be to focus on this like serving or mobilization component. How do we help our folks in this age group discover their calling, find their purpose, know that they matter, that they're valuable, even at this stage in their life? And that can be a variety of specific things, and we wanted to talk about them, right? I mean, we may do that through discipling or using curriculum like you guys' flourishing curriculum, or having particular days or projects where we're going to serve something in the community, a homeless mission or something, and we're going to go out together as boomers and older adults and do this. It's just that mobilization piece I think is really key, because used to senior adult ministries were built a lot around fellowship and social components, which are important because I just mentioned relationships, but that was like the main thing. Like, oh, you're going to start a seniors ministry. We want to have a luncheon once a month, and we want to have the barbershop quartet come in and sing, and we want to take a trip to see the fall foliage. And, none of those things are wrong. And they can be used really in great ways relationally, but we would sometimes build most of the ministry around that and neglect this piece of saying, wait a second, what do we have to give? Because there's still a lot, that they have still left to give. Though it may change, right? The role they play now may be different than the role they used to play. Yeah, I would say those are a couple foundational things.
Yeah, that's great. I noticed we have in this webinar a woman named Karen Pearson, who's leading an organization that's helping churches basically adopt local elementary schools. And one of the big pieces of that is the older adults who often have more time getting engaged in the schools. And I mean, that's an example. I find that really exciting. And I know some churches, I'm now learning of churches that are doing this. And so it's one of the things, I think one of the main things that you've emphasized is really seeing the potential of older adults for ministry. And sometimes we're asked, well, but what about when they get a lot older, right? I mean, and so let me ask you that.
Yeah.
What's that going to look like with somebody who really has a fair amount of limitation?
Yeah. Let me say this before I answer that. I like to kind of use an equation and say, we've got people with time, and I don't mean that like, oh, they got all this free time. I mean, people who are retired will often say, I have less time now than when I was working, but we have discretionary time. So time plus experience. I mean, the longer we lived, we've got all this work experience, life experience, plus resources. And that may be financial, but it may be other things. It may be you've had a large home and now everyone's gone and you have a room where someone could stay or whatever. Time plus experience plus resources equals significant kingdom impact. And one of the things I'll just say here is sometimes churches will think about, okay, we've got our retired adults and they can make coffee or be an usher or fold the bulletin. And that's what they do. And all good, important tasks. But it's short-sighted. That's small if we kind of lump everybody into that category. I love doing stuff like that. At my kids' school to volunteer and do paperwork stuff. I love it. I love to be up there. I love to just have nothing to think about and do that. But if I said, well, that's my serving for the week, I would be squandering other gifts and talents that I have. So I say that. Now, to your point about our physical bodies do decline. That's part of the aging process, right? When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, we became beings who were not going to live forever. And aging actually became part of the design to move us from this life to the next. And our society, man, wants to do everything we can to be like, oh, no, let's deny this. Let's color our hair, let's act young. When reality would say, there does come a point where our health does decline and we can't do as much. And I like to look a little bit at scripture. David was in his bed when he called Solomon in to, bless him. And, Paul, they would say kind of at the end of his life, we was still writing a letter, even though he probably had arthritis and was pretty beaten up. So, there were still roles to play. And one of the things I think that we make the mistake of doing is when somebody's more frail, they're searching for purpose. And we say, well, you can still pray almost like it's an afterthought. Oh, you can still pray, instead of reframing to realize that is quite potentially the most important work and ministry. And finding ways to engage that within our churches. Like, if we match up the youth who are going on a mission trip with certain older adults, and those youth, are connecting with them. And so then their older adults are praying for them, and they get together afterwards, to raise the value and the importance of that. Anyway, I think that's one thought around that idea. And, I'll say this quickly about roles changing. In science, there's leafcutter ants, right? I mean, and they're looking at those ants, and they have sharp mandible blades that cut the leaves. And they're finding that eventually over time, those sharp mandibles don't stay sharp any longer. They get too dull to cut the leaves. And when that happens, those ants are moved to a different role in the colony. And I kind of am like, oh my goodness, is that not like, consider the lilies of the field if God cares for them? And if God has a different role for ants to play, I believe he has that for us, even at the end of our life, when we physically may not be able to do the same things we used to do. Our role and our purpose may change.
So I've got a story. You may have heard me tell this, I don't know, but it so illustrates what you're talking about. So I had a woman in my church when I was pastoring down in Irvine, who an older woman who loved welcoming the visitors. That was like her ministry. She wasn't even officially like the visitor. She just would look for new people and run over to see them after worship and welcome them, get her husband to take them to lunch. I mean, she loved that and did it for many years. She was great. But as she got much older, she pretty much couldn't leave her home. And then she was pretty much couldn't leave her bed. And and part of what was devastating to her was her sense that she just had no purpose in life and felt very useless. And so this was a case of visitation, of course, as pastor. And so we talked about this, said, well, why don't you pray and see if God puts something on your heart? So then I come back to see her in a month, and she's so excited. And why? Because she got this idea. We had a church directory, picture of the family and their address and phone number. And her idea was to take the church directory, and every day she would call 3 or 4 families and just offer to pray.
Yeah.
And she started doing that. And it was kind of funny because sometimes she'd say, this is Johnny from the church, and people are like, oh, I know I haven't been in a while, I'm so sorry. She's like, no, I just want to know if I could pray about something. And sometimes people would say something very quick. Yeah, pray for whatever. And then sometimes it'd be more, but she had this incredible ministry of prayer from her bed, literally from her bed,
Yes.
for the last 2.5 years of her life. So that's an illustration of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So
definitely.
Well, there are large churches, and then there are lots of small churches. And obviously the way churches deal with the possibilities here is going to look different. So let me ask you first, if folk are from a larger church, what are some things they might think about? And then if folk are from a smaller church, what are some things they might think about?
Yeah. So, and some of these may have, people can connect the dots if they transfer or transferable principles. But one thing about a large church, if you have, I'm speaking directly to you, if you're at a large church, if you have on your church staff, a lot of kind of age designated type ministries, and you've got people that are staffed to do those, women's ministry, men's ministry, maybe some kind of young adult, or they call it like next gen ministry or college age, or, you have these different ministries, but you don't have anything for this kind of segment. Some call it older adults or encore or whatever. I think it's worth saying why not, right? Because what we put our resources to, what we put our staff to, can show what is a priority to us. So I just kind of say that as something to consider. Another thing to consider in a large church is if you do have someone who has been your senior adult or your pastoral care maybe person. I'm going to say staff person, paid, maybe not, maybe they've not been, but they're really known for that, right? That's kind of how they're identified. if you try to, if you, as that person, begin to kind of say, okay, we're going to try to reach down here at a little more of this boomer age segment. I just want you to know that there might be some bumps with that, because the church themselves is going to pretend, church people may feel like, and even the staff, other staff may be like, wait a second, you're the one who visits the really old people. I'm not old yet. Which are all ageism type attitudes, which we can unpack if we have time. But I just feel like we've got to recognize that reality. Sometimes churches will say, I can't figure out why this isn't working. And that's sometimes why, simply because people are resistant if they've identified that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm 66. So I think 30 years ago, I would have thought that's old. And
Right.
I'm here and I'm like, yeah, but I remember it was some years ago, and a good friend of mine was introducing me as a speaker to a group. And he introduced me as an elder statesman for the faith and work movement. I was like, oh my God. So things like that can be a little hard when you're in this space.
Right.
I'm not 90 yet.
Right.
So anyway,
Yeah.
what would you say that, I mean, that's so for larger churches, right? What for smaller churches? What's the potential there? What might you encourage them to do?
Yeah. So, in some ways, there's some things about a smaller church environment that make this work a little easier, because large churches are apt to kind of silo. We're more apt to put like age groups together. Now the pluses that come with that can be that we can have more opportunities, more ministries, different kinds of classes. We can have pickleball, we can have caring for your aging parent workshop, we can have all these things, whereas a small church may not be able to do all of that. And yet in a smaller church, we have more likelihood that those generations are connecting, in natural ways. So we want to kind of go with that, I would say, in a small church. Look at how to take those things and become more intentional about them, right? To even teach from the platform about connection between the generations. And really large and small churches, when we have the opportunity to do any kind of, teaching from the stage, to be able to speak to, a biblical view of this season of life, large church or small church. Now, I will say this, regardless, if you're large or small, what I have seen churches do that has been helpful or beneficial in them really kind of starting a ministry, to go back to that question, like, what do we do? Is put together what some churches call it like some kind of dream team. Because really, especially with baby boomers, they've got to be a part of the discussion and the decisions of what's going to happen if we're really going to be able to make something happen. And so, I heard this from a few different churches over the years, that they specifically asked high capacity people that were in that age group to say, hey, would you be a part of this team? We're going to just dream about what a ministry could look like with people that are your peers. And it's a short-term commitment, because that's a big deal for baby boomers. I'm only asking you to meet for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. And we're going to talk about, what kind of kingdom building ministry would you like to see happen? What are relational things that you think could be a connection point for people that are in this age group? So you begin to let other people hopefully get excited about this. I know some churches who have done that kind of dream team thing using my book, right? They gather together and they kind of read a few chapters and talk about it that way. Because in the past, sometimes senior adult ministry was often led by the one leader. He was the trip planner or she was the program director. And that's not going to be the best way to go about this, right? We want to equip others to catch a vision for this too. And that's the case if you're in a large church or small church, right? If you can have a paid staff or not have a paid staff, other people that are also excited about it.
That is interesting. As one who's been in both large and smaller churches, I mean, it's often the case that larger churches are more segmented for good reason. You need to, if you're going to be the body of Christ, you can't be 5,000 people. And so there's often more age segregation. I used to be in charge of a church that had the adult ministry of a church that had 12 classes, almost all of them age segregated, right? And so you're right, smaller churches are almost by nature more intergenerational. The thing I find so interesting, and Amy, you know this work, but my colleagues at Fuller Youth Institute some years back did a study on what is helping churches that are really doing well growing young. What's helping them? Why is that happening? And part of their conclusion was the churches that are actually doing well with younger adults, younger families, younger people, actually are intergenerational churches. So you could almost create a model. We want to reach the young families in our community. Therefore, we're really going to empower and encourage the older adults in our congregation, which I love. I'm thinking, they did this work on called Growing Young. I'm thinking I'm going to have my bestseller is going to be called Growing Old. What do you think? All right. Well, anyway, hey, we're getting some great questions. I had some more for you, but I really want to get to these, and thank you for putting in questions, and any of the rest of you can. So Rick says, please respond to this challenge. Be refired, not retired.
You want me to respond to that, or we just say yes? I think that's a great
are you one that I'm curious, I don't know. Are you one that thinks really Christians should never retire?
No, I wouldn't go. I don't like put my foot down on too many things, but I used to say, so I used to give talks and stuff when I was younger, and I would be like, retirement is never mentioned in the Bible. But, then I found out I'm wrong, right? Numbers chapter 8 talks about retirement, and it, in that place is where Moses is giving those instructions to the Levites through God, right? That, hey, when you get to the age of 50, you must retire from your service and work no longer. But it says, you can come alongside or mentor the younger generations in that work. And I think it's, again, an example of how our roles may change. So, we may not need to take a paycheck anymore, right? We may not need that, but that doesn't mean we don't have a purpose or something else to do, right? I love some of the stories I will hear of churches who actually have, an older adult as an unpaid staff member, right? But they are full-on staff member with the desk, the business cards, and the whole thing. And I think that re-envisioning some of that goes to this idea of being refired, not retired, is saying, okay, what now? What's next? So much of our world spends a lot of energy on the financial planning of retirement, right? But doesn't ask people to be thinking about, what am I going to do?
That's great. I met a woman down in Arizona who retired completely from her lifelong professional life, but she had a deep, deep passion and concern for the immigrants coming over the border. And I think she's working full time. But she's not getting paid in an organization that serves and cares for those people and seeks justice for them. And so you could say, yeah, she's fully retired, but she's not retired from being a disciple of Jesus and living her discipleship in the world. So, yeah, thank you. That's great. Okay. Question from I mentioned. Oh, this is Karen, whose organization I had mentioned is helping churches get connected to schools.
Oh, cool. Okay.
But she has a question, and she says, is part of the challenge that churches don't know what to offer or suggest or expect of those in the third? What are your practical ideas and suggestions for churches to engage older adults?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think you're right. They don't always know what to do. And like when you said, don't know what to offer, that's where that's getting nitpicky, but I would say, bring some of them along to figure out what to offer or do. And then I will just pitch out some things I've seen, right? The thing I was mentioning, like a done in a day type project, some kind of, creating some kind of, fun service opportunity that we're going to say, hey, this is going to be our boomer group. We're going to do this on the second Saturday of every month and come back and have a barbecue and talk about it or whatever. I think, creating some of those service project things, intergenerational things, like I feel like bring out people. I know a church who had their young people kind of create like almost like a workshop for a Saturday morning. And, here these juniors and seniors are putting together a 30-minute workshop on Instagram. And they set up a Genius bar, just like you would see at the Apple store. And then the invitation was for anyone, and especially older adults, to come to the church with their devices or anything and get any kind of help, assistance, coaching that they wanted. I remember the lady telling me about it, saying that one guy even wheeled in his desktop computer, desktop. So that, I think sometimes looking for those intergenerational activities can be one of the things that can be really beneficial to offer. And then, this is not exactly what you're asking, but I was thinking about it in terms of church leaders, or even if we have any chance, cross my fingers, that somebody's on the call that's actually a lead pastor, or you have the ear of a lead pastor, being able to speak about some of the life issues that are happening with people in this season of life in the third, and using those as illustrations, like in a sermon, and doesn't have to be long, right? But, telling the story of things that Mark has even shared today, right? You tell the story of the person who is at home, but they're calling in the directory, or tell the story about those who are, older and working in the local elementary schools, like we're discussing. And you find ways to tell those stories. So we're creating then a new normal, so that young kids and young adults are sitting out there saying, they're starting to get a different view of what older is, and can say, man, I can't wait till I'm that age, because that's when I'm going to invest in that, or I'm going to do that. That's one part of that. The other part would be illustrations, right? If we're talking about suffering, there's the suffering that a young person's walking through. There's the suffering of caring for a parent with Alzheimer's disease that a baby boomer may be walking through. So just mentioning those things lets those people in the congregation feel like, oh yeah, they see me. I'm not invisible.
That's wonderful. Yeah. My pastor's doing a version of what you, not only mentioning in sermon, but every few weeks he'll interview in worship one of the older adults in the church who's doing something interesting. And
I love that.
Yeah, I love it too. And it's just, and then they pray for Jan and her ministry or her work. And when I say ministry, I don't mean it's often not official, I'm in this ministry. It's just the way she's living her life in this season of life. So yeah, that's cool. Okay, we have a question from, thanks Karen for your question. We have a question from Jill, who says, this is cool. We sort of touched on this, but let's do it again. Discuss how smaller churches of 80 to 90 people might tap into ministry talents when a third are 70 to 90 years old and young families are busy working and raising families. You can talk about that.
So how churches could tap into talents that are part of that, maybe even that 70 to 90-year-old group. One thing I was thinking of when we were talking about practical suggestions, another thing that came into my mind is, intentionally being very intentional at matching up an older adult, and it could be in the 90 category or the 60 or wherever, and with a younger person as prayer partners. So I've seen churches do this, like the older adults, choose the high schooler's picture off the wall, and then they call them, and they're going to be praying for that high schooler throughout the year. I know a church in the Northwest who had done this, and the older person called, Sarah, I'm going to be praying for you. And Sarah's mom had breast cancer, so there was immediately something to pray about. And then the relationship grew when that young person graduated from high school and moved across the country to go to college and meet somebody and going to get married. This prayer partner and her husband flew over to go to the wedding. And I just think that would be another intentional way of, bringing intergenerational connections, and also, instilling that purpose of like, this one is praying for the other, and vice versa. It can even go both ways. Another thing is so basic, but we maybe don't do it enough, would be to just simply look for ways to eat together, share meals together. I had a pastor tell me one time that he was thinking, I'm going to figure out how to write into my budget that if an older adult will bring me a receipt to say that they had taken that young couple out to lunch, that I would reimburse them for that meal because I want to encourage that in my church. And I just, you know, whether he did that or not, I think there's just value in that, you know, sharing a meal with each other. And that a lot of times that can come from the older person, right? That it says, invites them over or goes out or whatever.
That's great. Yeah, there's some good biblical precedent for meal sharing.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Frank asks, because we're talking a lot about taking care of folks in the church, how do we focus on a community where the greatest demographic is the third folks? So it's, you know, not just our congregation, but, you know, we're here for our neighbors. How do we think about that?
Yeah, I love that. So, gosh, there's different ways to talk about that. So one thing that pops in my head would be even those outside the walls of the church, we know from research and stuff would say they're still kind of wrestling with what's my purpose now? What is my life? You know, where do I find my value now? It's been in my job or it's been in raising my kids. So I have seen where, you know, a church that is creating a way for people to serve, to volunteer, and invites those outside the walls to be a part of that just as much as someone inside the walls, right?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, hey, you can come along. We're going to be painting this Habitat house on Saturday. We'd love for you to be a part of that too. So creating those vehicles for people to do that, doesn't matter if we're part of the church building or outside, would be one of those. Another thing, totally different. We haven't talked about this much at all, and I can't dive into it. But some churches have taken it upon themselves, and really this would have to be a vision that your church would have, to create respite ministries, meaning, you know, maybe one day a month, or maybe they're able to do it one day a week, you know, from 9 to 2. They have the volunteer capacity and the building capacity to say, hey, you that are caring for an aging parent, or you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease, on this day, you can bring them here. We'll give you a break while we bless them and pour into their life. And that's a way to really reach out to the community as well. And I've seen some places do things like that.
You know, my church is experienced something that's really quite surprising. So, you know, at the pre-center, we've developed this 6-session video course called Flourishing in the Third of Life.
Yeah.
And one of the first places we did it was at my church. And so they advertised it within the church, and it's a small church. So we thought maybe we'd get, you know, a dozen people, and that'd be great. The first week we had like over 25 people, and half of them were from the community.
Yes.
We did nothing to promote in the community, but friends told their friends, hey, we're doing this thing at our church. And their friends wanted to come because there was so little out there for older adults who aren't part of a church or anything to sort of process, how do I live well in this season of life? And you're also right about the volunteering piece. I've seen that in some churches where that's actually one of their major means of outreach.
Yes.
Provide a place for people easily to come and give, because otherwise it's kind of hard to find it. So I love that. We got a few more. We got like, oh man, we're going to run out of time here. I'm sorry if I don't get to your questions, I apologize, but let's do a couple more. Oh, this is please repeat the formula mentioned about time, experiences.
Sure. And maybe if Jessica's listening, she can type it in there. Time plus experience plus resources equals significant kingdom impact. Yeah.
Awesome. That was easy. Okay, we'll do this one's which from Steve. Which one of you is going to develop a 10-question survey to help churches identify ageism in their midst?
Oh,
if you have age-focused staff, why is there no one working with baby boomers? So which of us is going to do that?
well, we've got a little research project we're working on. Maybe
I know,
it'll help.
we are. You know, this is Steve's the guy who got me to do the course that I just mentioned on Flourishing in the Third of Life. He said we could really use this. So now, Steve, you're probably going to get one of us to develop a survey on age. You know, that's an important. We're sort of making light, but that's an important question. And you know, mostly the ageism isn't, you know, a kind of bitter or mean ageism. It's more an exclusion and, at least in my experience, non-awareness and taking for granted kind of ageism. What do you think, Amy?
Yeah, I think often, you know, I like to give younger pastors and church leaders, and myself, the benefit of the doubt that it's not done out of a malicious kind of thing. It's just a lack of knowledge. When we rely on stereotypes, whatever it is, but in this case, we're talking about aging stereotypes, and those could be a variety of things. Oh, they don't want to learn something new. Oh, their memory's not as good as it used to be. Oh, whatever. When we rely on stereotypes, it's often because we have a lack of actual knowledge, or we haven't had real friendships and relationships that are varied with these people, and whatever group we're talking about. So, I think, just to you guys, whenever we have the opportunity to just nicely kind of be like, oh, I know you think that they might not want to do that or might not be able to learn that, but research would say we can keep learning even as we get older. Just those chances to kind of speak into when we hear those things, right? When we hear them pop up, and when we do them ourselves. Mark and I have talked before about like how we maybe say we have a senior moment and we're making a joke, but that's an ageism type comment. So it's a hard thing. I would say for you guys that are readers and stuff, I like Breaking the Age Code by Becca Levy.
Yeah.
Becca as a book or a resource about ageism, and some things of what we can do.
I agree. It's really a fascinating book. She's a professor at Yale, but she writes for ordinary folk, and it's really good. Yeah, my big age is, it's just font size. You go to a church, they'll hand out something. It's like, I didn't bring my magnifying glass today, and anyway, that's a kind of, it's not a mean ageism. It's just a kind of okay. We need to wrap up, and that means Tom and Frank, I'm going to have to not have Amy respond to your stuff, and I apologize for that. But we do need to wrap up and keep this on time so folk can be here for the whole thing. Well, Amy, I just think this has been fascinating. I've learned some things. I've read your stuff and I know you, but there have been some new things today, and I just am so grateful for this conversation. If you had sort of last words to say, and I think folk are here because they want to see their churches do this work well. If you have any sort of closing words of encouragement or exhortation, what would you say?
Oh, well, what would I say? I think sometimes this work, it's very rewarding, but sometimes it's hard because we're feeling like we're, trying to bring about something that we may not feel like other people quite realize the value of. So, keep after it, keep chipping away at it. Start with something, right? I mean, there's so many things we could do. Even I threw out just a few ideas today. Start with something, even if that's just having another conversation with somebody about it, or a conversation with a pastor about it. It's our privilege, really. I would just say it that way. It's our privilege to be able to come alongside people and help them finish well. So, continue to keep that like in the forefront of our minds and live that out ourselves.
And you talked about that conversation, and earlier talked about relationships. I mean, the thing I discovered long ago when I was a pastor of a church, is that you just ask questions of your people.
Yeah.
And what occurred to me as I think back, I would ask questions of my older adults about many things, but I don't think I ever really asked them much questions related to being older. Partly because I was young and I just didn't think of that. So I'd ask them about, their things. And I think they felt cared for by me, but I never would ask, like, what's it like getting older? I think I was also afraid to say those words, and, you don't want to say that maybe to a 43-year-old, but I just think so again, you're thinking about conversation. One of the things any of us can do with the people in our lives, our churches, also our communities, is just ask about it and learn. Right. And so that's kind of what you're saying there, and I love that. Well, Amy, it's been great to be with you in this context. And again, thank you for the work that you've been doing and are doing and will do It's been great to partner with you here, and I'm sure we'll do that again. So thank you so much for this time.
Oh, it's been great. Thanks for having me.
And just let me say to folk who are here, again, we are doing a lot of this with the Dupree Center in our third initiative, our Flourishing in the Third of Life initiative. You know, there's a link in the chat if you want to know more and learn more. And you go to our website, dupree.org. Up at the top nav bar, if you see third, you can go. And there you can find information about the course and other things we do, cohorts we do, and just a whole lot of stuff that we've created to be in service to you, including this webinar and link to it as soon as it's up on YouTube. So again, Amy, thank you. Thank everybody who's here. Jessica, thank you for being kind of the tech person behind all this and making it work. And and thanks be to God for the opportunity for this conversation. So goodbye, everyone.